The Conservative government was appealing that highly disputable decision. The incoming Labour government, for reasons it's never disclosed, chose to drop that appeal and subsequently has laid a draft remedial order to amend the legislation. Now, the problem with this, Mr. Speaker, is that earlier this year, the Northern Ireland Veterans Movement was granted permission to intervene in the case before the Supreme Court. And on the 15th of October this year, Lord Wilson Casey, acting for the movement, did just that and gave written and oral submissions which the court are now considering. Consequently, it's entirely possible that the declarations of incompatibility relied on by the Secretary of State to lay the remedial order will be quashed. The case is very much live, and this is very important because under Section 10 of the Human Rights Act, a government only has the authority to use a remedial order unless and until all appeals in relation to declarations of incompatibility have been determined or abandoned. This test is not met. And if the government decides to push ahead with its remedial order, not only will it be acting ultra vires, it will set a terrible precedent which will mean that future governments may use remedial orders in ways that they were never intended to use. To avoid this, all the government needs to do is to commit to not pushing its remedial order to a vote until the Supreme Court has finally ruled. Will the Secretary of State make that commitment?
Very well done. Secretary of State.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for the point that he has raised, but I would say to him that the argument he puts is not correct. The appeal was abandoned by the government in July 2024, and he says, for reasons that have never been disclosed, the government has been absolutely clear from the beginning, we disagree with immunity and we are committed to repeal and replace the Legacy Act. And Section 10 gives a Secretary of State the ability to make a remedial order when a declaration of incompatibility has been made and any appeal has been determined or abandoned. It has been abandoned by the government. Now, the honourable gentleman has suggested that the ongoing Supreme Court appeal in Dillon means that the conditions have not been met and therefore suggests that we may lack the vires to lay this order. I do not agree with his assessment and have made the position clear to the honourable member in the correspondence that we have had, I think an exchange of 2 emails and 2 letters. I can confirm to the House that in July 2024 the government formally abandoned its appeal concerning the declaration of incompatibility relating to immunity from prosecution. That declaration was not part of the appeal that is now before the Supreme Court. And the fact that the Northern Ireland Veterans Movement was granted permission to intervene does not alter this legal reality.
Foster.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last month, the House debated the Troubles Bill and we heard many moving contributions about the devastating loss experienced by families, including military families, many of whom are still seeking answers. Does the Secretary of State agree that the voices of those of the government's legislation, what it's for, should be at the forefront of our minds when we debate it and every time we debate it? Thank you.
I do agree with my honourable friend, and I would just further say that the honourable gentleman who speaks for the opposition and the principal opposition party remain, it seems, wedded to immunity, which was well, the honourable gentleman says once again, as he does in all these debates, conditional immunity. I think the last time we debated it, I reminded him what the legislation of the last government said. It said that the Commission must give immunity if the conditions for giving immunity are met, which are quite clearly, well, the honourable gentlemen have not reminded themselves of what their legislation said. All that was required was that for somebody to come forward and to say what they had done, and if what they had done was an offence, then the Commission must grant them immunity. And I would say to the opposition that at some point they do need to recognise that that provision for immunity for terrorists Because the last government said we wish to give immunity to terrorists, had no support in Northern Ireland. And I'm sorry that they don't recognise that, because I've said on many occasions, progress cannot be made in trying to deal with the problem of legacy when the provision that is in the current legislation, which we are committed to repeal and replace, has no support in the place that suffered more than anywhere else during the course of the Troubles.
Can I remind colleagues, if they wish to ask a question, they should be bobbing and try and reduce chuntering from the front benches. I ask the Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Dr Al Pinkerton.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the introduction of a remedial order is welcome and necessary, even if its timing is potentially vexed. This remedial order promises to finally end the policy of conditional immunity that was integral to the 2023 Legacy Act, a policy that may have had benign intentions, but which did put us at odds with our international legal obligations and which regrettably drew a moral equivalence between UK service personnel and terrorist paramilitaries. I note the Joint Committee on Human Rights' second report, published last week, which recommended its approval. However, I also note that committee's concern regarding the unusual sequencing and timing of the remedial order in relation to the forthcoming primary legislation. Now, given the overtly political processes that led to the 2023 Act, there is an additional responsibility, I would suggest, on this government to ensure that this process is handled properly and that the process, as much as the policy, is seen to be fair-handed. There is a broad recognition of the need to repeal and replace the 2023 Legacy Act, but we also need to acknowledge that the removal of conditional immunity has created real anxiety, particularly among veterans groups. They fear the risk of prosecution. And so I also welcome the Secretary of State's letter circulated yesterday, Annex A in particular. So can I just ask the Secretary of State, if I may, three things. First of all, to clarify...
You have exactly 1 minute and you've gone over, so my apologies. Secretary of State.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for what he said and for the support that he gives to what we are seeking to do in the remedial order. I acknowledge the responsibility that the government has. These are quite unusual circumstances, and the reason that we are here debating this is because the Joint Committee on Human Rights has acknowledged those unusual circumstances, and despite having made other comments in this report, which we will all have read, has come to the conclusion that they give their approval to this and have recommended that the House support it. And I welcome what the Joint Committee on Human Rights has had to say. I would also point out one other thing. The government, and I'll acknowledge this, did take a bit of time between the JCHR report on the 28th of February and producing the revised draft remedial order on the 14th of October. I just wish to inform the House, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the reason for that is that we had listened to the representations that have been made, particularly from the other side of the House, on the subject of interim custody orders in respect of sections 46 and 47, and in relation to the Supreme Court judgment in 2020. We reflected on that and we found what we think is an alternative way of achieving the same objective, and that is to be found in clauses 89 and 90 of the Troubles Bill that is currently before the House. And I would simply point out that the last government tried for 2.5 years to find a way of dealing with the Supreme Court judgment in the Adams case, was not able to do so, eventually accepted. The amendments moved in the other place that became sections 46 and 47, but it was acknowledging the arguments have been made that led the government, to amend the remedial order, which we then put before the House on the 14th of October.
Deputy Speaker, as a member of the Joint Committee on Human Rights, we published our second report on the Northern Ireland Remedial Order on 9th of December. The standing orders of both houses require the JCHR to scrutinise all remedial orders. The committee concluded that the virus of the order was satisfied and that all statutory requirements were fulfilled. However, the committee also felt that the circumstances were that it was only appropriate because the government gave compelling reasons about why this would have to come forward in this way while a bill was progressing through the House, and there was a Supreme Court case ongoing. Does the Secretary agree with me that, that although the circumstances and the timing are not ideal, this is the best way forward?
Well, I do agree with my honourable friend. The circumstances are unusual, but the government does believe it has a compelling case, and the JCHR agreed with the government's assessment. Yeah.
Father of the House.
There's been a lot of very complex legal arguments alluded to today, but I think what the public are concerned, what I'm concerned about, is the state of mind of our veterans, some of them quite elderly, who only sought to serve their country decades ago. So the Secretary of State is a very moderate, clever, reasonable person. Given that there's really, in reality, no chance of a successful prosecution, and people would be horrified if there was a prosecution, what comfort can the Secretary of State now give to our veterans?
Well, I agree with the right honourable gentleman that we only have to look at the figures to see that the prospects of any prosecutions in any cases are increasingly remote because of the passage of time, the difficulty in obtaining evidence. But what the government has done, having listened very carefully to the representations that veterans have made, has been to set out in legislation the protections, and we will return to the House when we consider the bill in committee. Protection from repeated investigation, the right to stay at home, to seek anonymity, protection in old age, protection from cold calling, and the right to be heard. And I hope that when veterans get a chance to see precisely how they're going to work, the fact that they are contained in the legislation, they will reassured that the government is looking out for their interests.
Member Adam Jogi.
Madam Deputy Speaker, it's always important for Northern Ireland to be discussed on the floor of this House. We are, after all, one United Kingdom, so I thank the Shadow Secretary of State for putting the question to us. But we must never forget the people of Northern Ireland. So can I ask my honourable friend what recent engagement he's had with victims, survivors and other organisations representing them as part of his work to address the legacy of the past?
I have had many such meetings. The Victims and Survivors Forum, for example, I've met twice in the recent past to explain the legislation that the government has published. I would make the point that there is a great lack of trust on the part of victims and survivors in Northern Ireland who feel they've been let down many times before. And trust undermined it's very hard to rebuild it. They are taking account of the legislation the government has passed. It won't surprise the House if I say I believe it does provide a foundation for moving forward. But it's really, really important, as my honourable friend has said, that their voice is heard and heard loudly.
Stuart Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On the 12th of November, I raised with the Prime Minister the alarming statement from 9 former generals that attacked the government's approach to lawfare against our armed forces. They said it would erode trust in the justice system and it was a threat to national security. Can the Secretary of State confirm if the Prime Minister has met with these 9 former generals, and has it changed his approach to attacking veterans?
Well, I don't accept the characterisation that the honourable member puts before the House. The government is not engaging in lawfare against veterans. Well, I refute. I've read that letter and many others. I refute the suggestion that the government is engaging in lawfare. We have been meeting a very large number of veterans' organisations. I myself have met the SAS Association and others. Ministry of Defence ministers have met. We are listening, and the House will see when we come to committee stage the results of those considerations, because the government is absolutely determined to ensure that there are proper protections in recognition of the hugely important and dangerous role that those who served in Operation Banner performed in trying to keep the people of Northern Ireland and indeed of the United Kingdom safe.
Peter Swallow.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As a member of the JCHR, I'm concerned that the Shadow Northern Ireland Secretary may have inadvertently misled the House when he suggests that our committee did not discharge our role seriously and consider all of the evidence in this case when we produced the report. The report which we produced recommended that this remedial order be made in no small part because of the incredible sensitivity around anything to do with the Northern Ireland Troubles and the need to make sure that we are building bridges across communities, and in no small part too, may I say, Madam Deputy Speaker, because of the seriousness with which the committee feels the Secretary of State takes this issue. It is therefore quite right, I believe, that the Secretary of State make this a remedial order. Does he not agree that it is not right, not serious politics, to play party politics with such a delicate issue?
Well, I would say to my honourable friend, who is a distinguished member of the committee, that I am grateful for the support that the Joint Committee on Human Rights has given for the remedial order and for the government's assessment of the compelling reasons. And personally, I'm not accusing anybody of anything else. I want to try and get this legislation right, as I've said to the House many times before, and I will work with all honourable members who will join me in that task.
Gavin Robinson.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State is perfectly entitled to pursue a policy desire of removing immunity. Indeed, he knows that my colleagues and I support that position. We found it quite difficult that yet another government was prepared to offer a different variation on immunity for the perpetrators of terror in Northern Ireland. We find that repugnant. So we support the notion that immunity should not stand. But that's not the question before the Secretary of State today. The question before the Secretary of State is whether he should misappropriate a remedial order process, which is about dealing with the incompatibility of human rights law, not incompatibility with his policy objectives. So for as long as a question still remains before the Supreme Court, which it does, though it's not his appeal, it is the Northern Ireland Veterans Movement, is it not better, given he's acknowledged there is an issue of trust on this issue, that he should just at least wait?
I would say two things to the right honourable gentleman. Firstly, I would reject the suggestion that I or the government has misappropriated a remedial order or misapplied Section 10 of the Human Rights Act. And I would cite in aid of that argument that the JCHR, whose job it is to scrutinise, well, he shakes his head, it is their job to scrutinise. If they had come to the House and said, we don't think the case is made, well, the government, of course, would have respected that. That is not what the JCHR said. The second reason is time is not waiting for the victims. It is not. And that is why the government thinks. There are those I've spoken to say, well, as long as it's still on the statute book, even though it has been declared incompatible, we doubt whether we can trust the process. And having decided, Madam Deputy Speaker, to keep the Commission but to reform it, I think it's right we remove that uncertainty as swiftly as possible, and that is what the remedial order is seeking to do.
I think the whole House can agree this is a very serious and sensitive topic. Can I ask members to be mindful with their language and ensure that they're not heckling whilst they are seated? I call Select Committee Member David Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State, you've already confirmed that under the Legacy Act, the immunity provisions were never commenced, and so therefore it's important to say that nobody ever was granted immunity under them. But sticking with the subject of immunity, the three Veterans Commissioners for Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales have all said they do not call for immunity under the law, but fairness under it. Does he agree with them?
I agree with that statement completely, which is why I must confess my disappointment that the opposition is still clinging to the notion of immunity, including immunity for terrorists. The Veterans Commissioners are quite right. They want fairness, and that is what the government is determined to deliver.
Sir Edmund Smith.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I just simply say to the Secretary of State, it does seem like ridiculous haste when the Act is going through right now, and that surely to do this when he knows for a fact that there is already an appeal going on does, as has already been said, become abusive in terms of the real purpose of a remedial order. And I suggest to him really that for all the stuff about the fact of people being let off, all to do with the fact of immunity,
That's not the issue. The issue today is, are they misusing their powers to rush something through which they could have dealt with through the course of this Act?
Well, I make 2 points to the right honourable gentleman who served with such distinction in Northern Ireland. Is first of all, as we have just heard, immunity was never commenced. It was declared incompatible. It was also struck down under Article 2. And I reject again the suggestion that the government is somehow abusing the process. If that was an argument, then one might have expected the Joint Committee on Human Rights to have agreed with it. It did not. It heard all of the points that have been put, and it concluded that in these particular circumstances it was right to proceed, and that is why it is recommending to the House that it should support the remedial order.
Katrina Murray.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This week's exhibition in the upper waiting hall is a memorial quilt produced by members of the South East Fermanagh Foundation. It's a very moving way to remember those who have been innocent victims of terrorism. The dates on those quilts panels remind us how long those families have been fighting for justice. Can I ask the Secretary of State what message he wants to send out to every person who has produced one of those quilt panels for theft, but also to all of those other families from this statement today?
Well, I met on Monday night with the families who'd come over for the unveiling of the quilts. Could I say to all members of the House, if you haven't had a chance to go up to the upper waiting hall to look at them, I would urge you to do so, because the story they tell is profoundly moving, but is a reminder of the continuing search for justice that so many people in Northern Ireland have got. And I would look at those quilts and say it is an argument for what we're trying to do to secure legislation that can actually help find those answers for all those people who are remembered on the quilts that are upstairs.
Robin Swan.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. In regards to the Secretary of State and the accusation about rushing this through, he will be conscious of an Irish government that isn't rushing anything through in regards to the support, in regards of what's actually doing. Yesterday, the Justice Minister in the Republic of Ireland received permission from the government to draft priority legislation to enable state bodies to give oral evidence to the UMA inquiry. Madam Deputy Speaker, that was only because the UMA families are taking legal action. Can I ask the Secretary of State what engagement he has had with the Irish government, actually in regards to bringing forward legislation that matches what is he bringing forward to this place? And can I actually ask him, who's he dealing with at the minute? Because it used to be the Taoiseach Simon Harris, who's now been promoted, or is it the Justice Minister who's bringing forward this, or is it the new FDA Minister?
Well, my most recent meeting, and I have many meetings with Irish ministers and discussions with the Taoiseach of the Taoiseach, was with Helen McEntee, who has just taken over from Simon Harris at the Foreign Affairs Ministry. I very much welcome the fact that the Irish government has announced that it's preparing to draft the legislation, as Simon Harris had committed to me while standing next to me, in time for the next hearings of the Omagh bombing inquiry, because that is evidence that the Irish government intends to fulfil the commitments it's made in the joint framework.
Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to commend the Secretary of State for the care he's taking to be as fast as possible for those victims, survivors and veterans' families who need to hear answers, but the care that he's taking to make sure this is legally correct. And I would echo the comments about the South East Fermanagh Foundation quilt in Parliament today, which reminds us of the need to get those answers for families. And can the Secretary of State confirm that he's concerned, as I am, that the opposition are just interested in making political points rather than really building peace, which is what we need to do together as members of the House? And would he confirm that the remedial order removes what would have been immunity for terrorists?
Well, I would say to my honourable friend, I think all members of the House have a shared commitment to trying to ensure that the peace that Northern Ireland has enjoyed since the signing of the Good Friday Agreement is maintained. All of us do. We have a difference of view about in some respects, about the right way of seeking to do that. And I am always willing to be challenged on the arguments that I put on behalf of the government and to challenge the arguments that I hear from the opposition front benches. In the end, we know that we have to deal with this because the last bit of legislation failed to achieve, as someone said earlier, whatever its intentions, failed to achieve its purpose. It did not command support in Northern Ireland, and that is why we have to make progress.
Sir Julian Lewis.
May I just ask the Secretary of State to clarify whether his earlier remarks mean what I think they mean, which is that even if it had not been for the guidance of the Joint Committee on Human Rights, the government would anyway wanted to have repealed the legislation of the Legacy Act. It's a political decision, and given that he said that he did not believe that there would be convictions at the end of this process, does that not mean that there will be several, if not many, trials? And if no one is convicted at the end of the process, how does that help anyone? And how does it avoid just torturing the people who are put through the trials?
Very good. Well, if I may just correct what I think was the interpretation that the Right Honourable Member was putting on what I had said. I made it quite clear a moment ago. Had the Joint Committee on Human Rights reached a different conclusion about the appropriateness of the remedial order, the government would of course respect it. I also made clear in my earlier comments, this government came into office committed to get rid of immunity. We've been quite clear about that from the start, and the remedial order will seek to give effect to that. If one looks at the figures, we've discussed prosecutions of veterans. There has been one successful prosecution of a veteran since the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. One. And the point I was making is, if you look at the figures, well, there are currently 9 live cases before the courts relating to the Troubles. 7 of them relate to paramilitaries, 6 of those relate to the provisional IRA. And I've heard the argument from those benches opposite, oh, well, none of the paramilitaries are getting prosecuted. That is not the case. It's really important that we have these debates on the basis of facts.
Jim Allister.
The Secretary of State doesn't need me to tell him that he and the government are struggling to command veteran support for his bill. Could I therefore ask him, in order to address that deficit of support, should he not consider an amendment to Clause 3 to have the Veterans Commissioner for Northern Ireland serve on the Legacy Commission? Wouldn't that be a token of making good on the Secretary of State's affirmation that this is about capturing the confidence of veterans and not pursuing lawfare against them?
Well, as I've already indicated, I reject the suggestion that the government is in any way engaging in lawfare against veterans, in the same way that I reject any suggestion there are such things as politically motivated or vexatious prosecutions. Well, the honourable gentleman says from a sedentary position, oh, come on. I've heard those words from opposition members in previous debates on these questions. There will no doubt be a number of amendments and suggestions made when we come to detailed consideration of the bill, and we will consider them at the time.
Sir Geoffrey Cox.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I wonder if the Secretary of State can assist me with this problem. The Supreme Court is at the moment seized of the issue as to the lawfulness of the declaration of incompatibility. The fact that the government has withdrawn its appeal does not prevent the Supreme Court from ruling on it. Let us suppose the Supreme Court rules that the declaration of incompatibility is void. Suppose that would mean, therefore, that that legal position is that the declaration of incompatibility would be void. And therefore the basis on which the order that the Secretary of State is proceeding on would be removed. Surely it would be prudent to wait to see if the Supreme Court rules on it, because otherwise what he will be doing is proceeding with an unlawful order. I wonder if the Secretary... I mean, I'm asking in the spirit of genuine curiosity and inquiry, not political partisanship. If this is going to bring this entire process into disrepute, if what he's doing is in fact acting upon an unlawful basis.
Well, once again, I would say I don't accept that the government is acting on an unlawful basis. Given the honourable gentleman's distinguished legal credentials and experience, I would say to him, I note that he encourages me to speculate on a potential, well, he does, on a potential outcome. The government has to deal with the position as we find it. I've already set out to the House why the government is absolutely clear in its view that because the appeal was withdrawn, we are able to make use of Section 10 of the Human Rights Act in order to remove conditional immunity.
Sarah Potin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Yesterday, Air Chief Marshal Sir Richard Knighton highlighted the need to recruit people into our armed forces in order to protect this nation. My question to the Secretary of State is, how does he expect to do that when those that served gallantly in Northern Ireland face prosecution? Why would young men and women join our armed forces with the risk of that happening to them? What message does that send to those young people?
I would say to the honourable member, I meet many young people in my constituency and other duties who are very keen to come and serve the nation in the armed forces. I am not aware of any figures that suggest that there has been a decline in recruitment. If she's seen them, perhaps she could draw them to my attention, because trying to get dealing with the past right should not affect the willingness, particularly the threats that we face in the modern world, from encouraging young people and others to come forward and serve the nation as people have done over the centuries.
Dr. Andrew Morrison.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Secretary of State has spoken of additional protections in his legislation. Why does he think that Operation Banner veterans, some of whom I represent, remain unconvinced and remain troubled? And why does he think that the Irish Prime Minister believes that there are no additional protections? And whilst he's about it, can he do something to reassure veterans who are feeling very unhappy with this, perhaps along the lines of saying categorically that no former terrorists or members of proscribed organisations will serve on the Legacy Commission?
Well, I've already made it clear to the House that those who have engaged in paramilitary activity, as long as I'm in this post, have no intention of appointing them to any of the posts that are contained in the bill. On the protections, I think we all have a responsibility to explain and to point out that they are in the draft legislation in clauses 30, 31, 36, 91, 84, 54, 56, 69 and 8. They are real, tangible protections, and they do respond very directly to the concerns that veterans have raised with the government. The reason we've introduced them is because of our determination to make sure that veterans are treated properly.
Alex Easton.
Deputy Speaker, Secretary of State, the official opposition are saying to hold off on the remedial order until the Supreme Court judgment. Have you actually sought any legal advice on this, and can you share it with the House?
Not yet. The word "you" is not appropriate, so if he wants to rephrase and quickly get to his point.
Has the Secretary of State sought any legal advice on the issue, and can he share it with the House? And can he also give us an update on the Irish Government in terms of making sure that the Irish Government produce all legal papers on their role on the IRA and the involvement of the Garda Síochána?
Well, as the honourable gentleman will be well aware, there is a long-standing tradition that the government does not reveal the legal advice it receives. All governments receive legal advice, but we don't share it because that's part of the business of government. I've already made reference to the announcement that the Irish government has made in respect of legislation to enable witnesses to give evidence to the Omagh bombing inquiry, which I welcome.
John Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can the Secretary of State confirm whether or not the remedial order will have to be voted on in the other place?
Yes, it will be voted on in both houses in the new year.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Despite what the Secretary of State continues to say in this House, the prosecution of elderly veterans has been vexatious. In the Soldier F trial, the judge agreed with the submissions of the defence that the threshold to prosecute was far from being reached. Political interference brought this matter to court. How, if the Secretary of State can't even accept that there's been vexatious prosecutions, does he ensure that this remedial order gives a clear distinction between the bomber who presents him or herself as a victim and the ordinary man and woman or child who were murdered or maimed by the actions of terrorists?
Well, there is the clearest distinction between the two groups of people that the honourable member refers to, and I've made it clear from the dispatch box on a number of occasions. There is absolutely no equivalence between those who sought to protect the public and those who committed the most appalling terrorist atrocities. I have to respectfully disagree with the honourable member, because if she is arguing that prosecutions have been vexatious, she is saying that our independent prosecutors are working on a basis that is out with their task, which is in all cases, look at the evidence, is there a reasonable prospect of a conviction, is it in the public interest to prosecute? And if we undermine the independence of independent prosecutors, the separation between the government and the court system, we are sunk as a nation. And that is why I'm so firm in saying there is no such thing as a vexatious prosecution.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Notwithstanding the fact that the Secretary of State has said the chances of a successful prosecution are very limited indeed, the fact is the punishment is in the process of investigation and trial in the first place. So will the Secretary of State now look sympathetically at appropriate amendments to the bill to make sure that the bar is raised very, very high, so it's almost impossible for one of our brave veterans to be prosecuted in our courts?
Well, as I've said to the House before, of course I will look carefully at all of the amendments that are put down to the bill when we come to debate it at committee stage and report of the whole House here. The test, as I indicate in answer to the previous question, for prosecutions is the same now. It will be the same in the future as it has been for the last 30, 50, 70 years. Those of greater legal experience will be able to tell the House how long that has been the case. It will not change because it depends on the evidence. What we are doing is setting out in the bill that in order to reinvestigate things, the Commission has to be of the view that it is essential to do so, and that is a very high bar, the word essential.
Final question, Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Canova report was clear in proving that there was no evidence of state collusion or machinations, and yet the Republican drum still bangs to cover the sound of the voices of the innocents, calling for justice and to be heard. So how will the Secretary of State respond to the lack of protection for the service personnel and the perpetual deliberate focus on them, and look at the 2,057 murders carried out by Republicans and the 1,027 loyalist murders which haven't received any justice at all, and will provide yet another whitewash over the blood of the innocents have been shed, and the impact it still has on all of those families throughout the province? Thank you.
Well, I say to the honourable gentleman, for whom I have the greatest respect, I think he and I hope the whole House, share the desire to enable answers to be provided for all those families who are living with the pain of not knowing what happened to their loved ones. The Canova report has made a very important contribution to seeking to uncover the truth. We have drawn on a number of the lessons of Canova in drafting the legislation, including the Victims and Survivors Advisory Panel, because many people said that was one of the great things about the way Canova went about its job. It is in the draft bill that the House will consider again shortly.
Point of order, Peter Swallow.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On a point of order, the point I was trying to raise in my question to the Secretary of State was that on any issue to do with the Northern Irish Troubles, we must tread with appropriate solemnity and seriousness. It was therefore disappointing to be accused of being an idiot by the opposition front bench whilst making this very point. So could I ask, what advice would you give me on ensuring that the honourable member for Raleigh and Wickford appropriately apologises, not to me, but to this whole House, for lowering the tone of this serious debate?
If I had heard any inappropriate language, I would have dealt with it very swiftly and dealt with that member involved, and no inappropriate language should be used in the chamber. And a topic such as this, which is highly charged, emotional and very serious, we need to double down and make sure we're using the most appropriate language. Now, Mr. Francois, before you respond, please remember you're also responding to me in the chair. No doubt you will not want to displease me either with any of your response going forward. Mr. Francois.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm too experienced to try and displease you in any way. For clarity, I was responding to the fact that the honourable gentleman had accused, had accused my right honourable friend of saying something which, as Hansard will prove conclusively in the morning, he clearly did not say. So, if he feels that word, and you, Madam Deputy Speaker, was inappropriate, I withdraw it. But I will say I still believe that the honourable gentleman was wrong.
I do not wish to prolong the debate, and no doubt that will be seen by most as an apology. We have finished this urgent question. I'll give the front benches a few moments to shuffle over. If the Secretary of State would be seated, I can. Urgent question, Dr. Caroline Johnson.
If the Secretary of State will make a statement on the Pathways Puberty Blockers trial.
Secretary of State, West City.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And let me just start by acknowledging the sensitivities around this issue, the strong beliefs held around this House, and for all the division and divided opinion we have, there is a shared determination of everyone, I believe, in this House to do the right thing by a vulnerable group of children and young people. It is for those reasons that I'm taking the course of action that I am. Put simply, that is to follow expert clinical advice and take an evidence-led approach. The CAS review found shocking levels of unprofessionalism, a lack of clinical oversight, and puberty blockers prescribed to children without sufficient evidence that doing so was safe or beneficial to those children and young people. What Dr. Hilary Cass uncovered was a scandal. That is why, on coming to office, I made the temporary ban brought in by my predecessor a permanent ban. Dr. Cass also recommended a thorough study to establish how best to support children and young people suffering gender incongruence. That is the Pathways study. It has 4 main parts, one of which is the clinical trial to study the effects of puberty-suppressing hormones on young people's physical, social and emotional well-being. The other aspects of the Pathways study will track the physical, social and emotional well-being of all young people attending UK NHS gender services. It will look at young people's thinking and brain development following both those who are and are not taking puberty-suppressing hormones. And it will gather evidence direct from young people, parents and staff about their experiences of living with gender incongruence. The bar for this trial to be approved was extremely high, and oversight will be rigorous. Children cannot consent to being on this trial, so places will require parental consent as well as the assent of young people. And because protecting and promoting the health and well-being of affected young people is our primary concern, there are strict eligibility criteria in place to join the Pathways clinical trial. As such, the number of young people who would expect to qualify for the trial will also be low. Participants must undergo thorough mental and physical assessments and will be followed over a number of years with regular well-being checks. Puberty blockers have also been used to delay puberty in children and young people who start puberty much too early. Use in those cases has been extensively tested and has met strict safety requirements for that use. The study is being led by King's College London and the South London and Maudsley NHS Foundation Trust. It has been carefully checked by independent scientists who advise the National Institute for Health and Care Research and by the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency and received approval from a Research Ethics Committee. Madam Deputy Speaker, I am treading cautiously in this area because the safety of children must come first.
Dr. Caroline Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I first must declare my interest as a consultant paediatrician who has looked after children with gender dysphoria in the past and is likely to do so in the future. And we must remember that there are vulnerable children that we are talking about today. Madam Deputy Speaker, the first and most obvious question is why? Why has this government chosen to fund experiments with puberty blockers on physically healthy children? Despite saying he was comfortable with this trial in a briefing to MPs, the Secretary of State told the media on Friday and Select Committee this morning that he is in fact uncomfortable with it. Why is it even being considered before the data linkage study is complete? 9,000 children went through the Tavistock. Many of them came out regretting being encouraged to irreversibly damage their bodies. We should look carefully at those outcomes before we make the same mistakes. What steps is he taking to secure the data from the Tavistock and have it analysed? What steps is he taking to hold to account those obstructing access to data linkage information? And what assessment has he made of the motivations of those obstructing that data when this is a study to safeguard children? And what of the trial itself? 226 children will go through this trial. Is that a limit or a target? These children will be randomised to getting puberty blockers now or in a year's time. All will be analysed at 2 years. They will still be children. They may only be 11 years old. How can these results demonstrate a meaningful outcome? The control group isn't properly randomised but chosen from the Horizon Intensive Trial Group. Is the Secretary of State concerned that this will introduce bias? The criteria of getting puberty blockers under this trial requires just one parent to consent and for the clinician to think it will benefit the child. But on what basis will the clinician decide? The CAS review said the vast majority of children with gender dysphoria will recover, with only a few persisting with trans identities into adulthood. It is not possible to predict which those children will be. So does he accept that the vast majority of children in this, his treating trial, will be given drugs, will be physically healthy children whose distress would get better without any puberty blockers, and that therefore the vast majority of the children in this trial are being unnecessarily experimented on with risky medications under his leadership?
The Shadow Minister asks why, to which there is a simple answer. Why is because it was recommended by Dr. Cass in the Cass review, which was commissioned by my predecessor, Sir Sajid Javid. I think that was the right thing to do, and it's why when my predecessor brought forward the Cass review, I supported it in opposition and certainly didn't try and play politics with an extremely vulnerable group of children and young people. In terms of why, I'll tell her why, because under the previous government, those puberty-suppressing hormones were prescribed without proper oversight, supervision or safety, and we didn't hear a peep for years about that fact until Dr. Cass, commissioned by Sir Sajid Javid, who deserves enormous credit for it, did the study that was published, widely supported, with this recommendation. And they may have changed their tune in opposition, but I do remember what the Conservatives said in government when they published the Cass review and supported its recommendations. And I think that is a real shame. She accuses me of inconsistency, so let me be clear, Madam Deputy Speaker. Am I comfortable that this clinical trial has undergone the proper process and ethical approval to ensure the highest standards and supervision? Yes, I'm comfortable about that. Am I uncomfortable about puberty-suppressing hormones for this group of young people, for this particular conditions? Yes, I am, because of risks. It is why I was also uncomfortable when I put in place upheld the temporary ban by my predecessor, but then put in place a permanent ban. The reason I was uncomfortable with that too is because I had to look children and young people in the eye and their parents who told me in no uncertain terms that that decision was harmful to them, as have many other clinicians who've opposed that decision. And the reason why, whatever my discomfort in this extremely sensitive area, I have made this decision is because I am following clinical advice. And because as Health Secretary, it is my responsibility to follow expert advice. And had the Tavistock Clinic faced such challenge and scrutiny a decade ago, we wouldn't be in this mess. The Conservatives were right to commission the Cass review. They were right to accept its recommendations. I accept there is now a difference on this particular recommendation. I would urge members not to walk away from the cross-party consensus we built behind that approach, to build on the work that Dr Cass has done. As for the important questions she raises, there will be 2 groups within the trial, as well as a further control group of children and young people with gender incongruence who do not receive puberty-suppressing hormones. At least 226 participants are required in order to detect a statistically significant difference between the 2 treatment groups. However, this is not a target, and no young person will find themselves on this trial because there is a drive to make sure there is a certain number of young people participating. In order to participate in this trial, it has to have the most robust clinical oversight from clinicians within the service, as well as national oversight and the consent of parents. And it is only where it is deemed that young people would benefit that they will be on this programme. She asked about the data linkage study. That's important. The data linkage study will be undertaken. When the data linkage study is completed, it will not provide us with the same evidence as this clinical trial. That's why Dr Cass made a distinction between this trial and the data linkage study. She asks about the motivations of those who withheld data. That is an extremely important question. I think it is utterly appalling that anyone in a position of responsibility in the NHS withheld data on a very vulnerable group of children and young people. I also accept that while there were many people in the Tavistock Clinic involved in these services, the fact that Dr Cass found such a lack of rigour, such a lack of standards, such a lack of proper oversight is disgraceful. And it is the clinicians who are well-meaning and ideologically driven that have given me most cause for concern in this whole debacle and have done more harm to children and young people and the trans community than most other people who've taken part in this debate and discussion. Finally, I do appreciate the work that Dr Cass has done. I'm glad that she is in the other place, bringing welcome scrutiny. Were she not supportive of this approach, I may think again. She's given her recommendation, she's given her support. I'm following clinical advice. It is not comfortable, but I do believe it is the right thing to do on balance.
Select Committee Member Danny Beales.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The front bench opposite asks why. Well, why? Because trans people exist and their health needs exist. And as the spokesperson for the government has clearly outlined, an independent review made a series of recommendations. There were clearly failures of healthcare, and a further recommendation was a clinical trial to address this issue. I believe the opposition supported the Cass review, but when it comes to implementing this part of it, suddenly there's collective amnesia on the benches opposite about what Dr Cass recommended. And doesn't the Secretary of State agree that in the absence of a trial, there isn't no access to these drugs? We know that young people are seeking out private provision. They are seeking unregulated providers of these drugs, and therefore a clinical trial is both appropriate and the best and safest way of managing any potential risks.
I thank my honourable friend. I have to say that risk he sets out was one of the considerations that I had to weigh up. Firstly, when upholding the temporary ban, then when making the ban permanent. And I do worry that outside of a trial, we may continue to see unsafe, or unethical practice, and I think we will be doing a service to medicine in this country as well as internationally if we have a high-quality trial with the highest standards of ethics, approvals, oversight and research from some of our country's leading universities and healthcare providers to make sure that for this particular vulnerable group of children and young people, we're taking an evidence-based approach to health and care.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Helen Morgan, you have up to 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would hope that everyone in this House can agree that medical treatment should always follow the evidence on safety and effectiveness. And it's right that expert clinicians are building this evidence base, and therefore right that the government is seeking to run this trial, because it should be led by evidence and not by ideology. So, given that the numbers on the trial are going to be very small, and the waiting list for talking therapies, which is so important for children and their parents, is very, very long, with hundreds of thousands on the waiting list, can the Secretary of State explain how he will increase access to NHS talking therapies so people can get the help that they need and deserve? And in a field with so little research, can he confirm if the Pathways trial is looking at international best practice in order to take learnings from abroad?
I'm grateful to the Liberal Democrat spokesperson for her question. I can absolutely assure her that we are doing that wider research, that of course we will take into account high quality international evidence as well as the research we're undertaking domestically. It is so important that we recognise that for many young people with gender incongruence, even if approved, puberty blockers will never be the right medication. And one of the things that I have been most saddened by with the discourse among adults in this debate, many of whom should know better, is that by elevating puberty blockers to the status that they have received in public discourse and debate, there are many young people out there who think that not only is this the gold standard of care, but it is the only care available. And of course, that is not true. NHS England has opened 3 new children and young people's gender services in the North West London and Bristol, with a 4th planned for the East of England in 2026, and we aim to have a service in every region of England in the coming years. These services use a different model with multidisciplinary teams, including mental health support and paediatrics within specialist children's hospitals to provide good clinical care. The new services will increase capacity, reduce waiting times so that patients can be seen sooner and closer to home. And we've also commissioned additional support for young people waiting to be seen through local children and young people's mental health services.
Only because I can't see her in any more pain. Preet Gill.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank my honourable friend for his leadership. But can I just say, as a former Children's Services Manager, I am concerned that credible safeguarding warnings from clinicians and academics about puberty suppression in children are not actually being heard. So will the Secretary of State meet those experts and review the younger age limit for participation in this trial, given that children as young as 10 are currently set to be involved?
I'm really grateful to my honourable friend for her question, and let me reassure her and the House that I am absolutely open to receiving representations and evidence from clinicians involved in the care of children and young people with insight, expertise and data, including those who might be critical of the approach that the trial team is setting out, or indeed critical that the CAS review included this recommendation. The reason why I think that is important is because of the many things that's gone horribly wrong in this area was the silencing of whistleblowers, the silencing of rigorous debate and discussion. Of course, we've got to do that with due care and sensitivity in mind, for young people in particular in this vulnerable group, for the wider trans community who feel extremely vulnerable in this country at the moment, including as a result of decisions I have taken as the Health and Social Care Secretary. So we have to consider all of that in the round. But we must make sure at all times we're following the evidence, that we're open to scrutiny and challenge, and that where we're making these finely balanced judgments, that we're doing so with rigorous debate, the testing of the arguments, the testing of the evidence and data. And that's why I do welcome the urgent question in this discussion.
Committee Member Joe Robertson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State said earlier that there is an extremely high bar to him stepping in and stopping these tests using puberty blockers. What bar could be higher than a government protecting children from being tested on with drugs specifically to stop or alter their sexual development. There is not a unified clinical view on this. It is his choice. He's the Secretary of State. These tests are on him.
Look, I certainly don't need to be told what my responsibilities are in relation to this. I always take responsibility for decisions I take. I acknowledge the extent to which he and members of his party are seeking to weaponise this issue and to personalise it. We can just simply refer back. We can just simply refer back to the honourable gentleman's question just now, and we can refer to the reference of the shadow ministers to the streeting trial. If that is not personalising, I don't know what is. But I'll tell you what. I'll take an evidence-based approach. I have done that on this issue from day one. Had the Conservatives done so, we would never have seen the Tavistock scandal. We would never have seen puberty blockers dished out willy-nilly to children and young people in this vulnerable patient group. I have sought at all times, including when I was sat on those benches, to treat this debate with the care and sensitivity and the humility it deserves, to not be tribal in my interactions. I only wish this Conservative opposition would take the same approach.
We're only at the start of this urgent question, so I ask members to reduce the temperature in the chamber. Rachel Taylor.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I thank my right honourable friend for the care and sensitivity he has taken to this subject all along. It's been an undeniably difficult year for transgender people in Britain. I've spoken to young trans people who've been pushed to the brink of suicide by what they hear, that they don't have a right to exist, that they don't deserve rights, that they're legitimate targets for ridicule. And we all in this House have a responsibility to lower the temperature and focus on their welfare, health and dignity. King's College operate the highest standards of safety. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that their expertise and rigour will support the well-being of participants and ensure we get the robust evidence we need and that vulnerable children are no longer treated as political punch bags?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. She's absolutely right. That we must engage with due care and sensitivity on this issue. I can share with the House that these exchanges, government policy, what is said by me and others, is followed extremely closely by this group of children and young people who are extremely online, by the wider LGBT+ community, and my honourable friend is right, that trans people are often at the wrong end of the statistics when it comes to being victims of hate crime and discrimination and mental ill health. We must always tread carefully when talking about suicide in this context and bear in mind the warnings of the government's advisor on suicide prevention, Professor Lewis Appleby, and the way in which that issue has been deployed irresponsibly by critics of the ban on puberty blockers that was put in place. We bear all of those things in mind. I do think we've got a high quality trial set up. I do have confidence in the clinicians. We've had a cross-party briefing from the clinical team. I'm very happy to repeat that exercise and to keep coming back to the House and to arrange briefings for MPs on a cross-party and for peers on a cross-party basis so that we can follow this closely as we should.
Tom Tugendhat.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the care with which my right honourable friend has approached much of this, and I appreciate that he has before him some very difficult decisions, especially because of the way the report was written. But I must come back to the simple truth that these are very, very young children. Decisions will be made for them, I appreciate, by parents taking that element of consent, that are genuinely irreversible. And whatever happens, we're going to see 8, 9, 10-year-olds grow up to 18, 20, 25-year-olds, at least we hope we will, who have effectively been experimented on. Now, some of those children are going to resent very greatly, not just the system, not just their parents, but those who allowed this to happen. And here I identify the Department for Health and Social Care, not necessarily the Minister himself. What provision is he putting in place to make sure that should those children wish to bring legal action against the department, against those who took these decisions at a time when they were not able to give any form of informed consent, they will be able to have redress, they will be able to have their day in court.
Can I firstly thank the Right Honourable Member for the way in which he puts his concerns, and I know he is concerned about this trial. I know he's stated publicly his opposition to it, and I enormously respect the way in which he has done that. And these are finely balanced judgments, and I acknowledge that. The CAS review found that puberty blockers have been prescribed routinely without good evidence for their safety or effectiveness, and that's why a clinical trial was proposed. They are licensed and used safely in much younger children for precocious puberty or older adults for certain cancers. For adolescents, the interaction with all the different processes of puberty may be very significant, which is why more evidence and a better understanding of their impact is needed in this patient group. Anyone on the trial can choose to stop taking puberty-suppressing hormones and leave the trial at any time. They do not need to give a reason. If a young person decides to stop taking puberty-suppressing hormones, their care in the NHS, including the gender service, will not change in any other way, and their doctors will explain to them and their parent or guardians what treatment options are available. And I know there are concerns about longer-term impacts on fertility. Prospective participants will be given comprehensive information on the advantages and potential risks of these hormones, including details about preserving fertility. Doctors will explain the possible long-term consequences and available options. Young people will also be offered to consult a fertility specialist, and the young person and their parent or guardians must clearly demonstrate a full understanding of all of these issues, and only then, after that, would a clinician sign off on the admission to the trial.
I ask colleagues to keep their questions short and for the Secretary of State to keep his responses on point. Select Committee Member Josh Fenton-Quinn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I hope that we can all agree that the young people involved should not be used by anyone as a political football. Can my honourable friend please assure me that this process and trial will be clinically led and not as a result defined by rhetoric in this place or anywhere else?
I can certainly give my honourable friend that assurance.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I also welcome the tone and the sensitivity that the Right Honourable Gentleman has taken to this issue, not just today but throughout. We all recognise that we should be led by evidence in this. It's absolutely vital. But the trans community is, as has already been mentioned, a reality. They feel very vulnerable, very attacked, and there are those who have been on these medications for some time and are now concerned that they may no longer be available. What can he tell us to reassure them that they will be safe?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, there have been, as I reported at the time that we put in place the permanent ban, there have been arrangements for people who were previously being prescribed puberty blockers. For people who wanted to access them but couldn't once the ban came in, they have not been able to access them through authorised means. I recognised when I took that decision and through the representations that I have received both directly and in writing, that caused considerable pain and distress to a very vulnerable group of children and young people and people who care very much about them. That has not been something I'm indifferent to and something that I have taken very much into consideration. But with respect to all of those people I have met, no amount of political pressure should deter a health secretary from moving away from the clinical advice and expert opinion that really should underpin these sorts of decisions.
Tom Hayes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the trial and I commend the Secretary of State for following clinical advice and for the work of government in trying to build a consensus for the most minoritised communities in our country. Can I ask the Secretary of State, a man who I know to have empathy and thoughtfulness, to speak directly to trans people who will be watching this debate, who may at this Christmas time be struggling with estrangement from family and from other difficulties? Can he speak to the dignity and worth to which they are entitled and send a message that this House has their back?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for that question. Look, I recognised that the decision I took, literally within days of coming into this office, was received by trans people in particular and the wider LGBT plus community as a negative decision that detrimentally impacted on their rights and identity. That was why it was an uncomfortable decision for me to take. I knew how it would be received, and I had to balance up risk in that decision. I believed it was, and I still believe, by the way, it was the right thing to do for the right reasons, a clinically led decision. And when it comes to the care and health for children and young people in particular, I make no apology for exercising extreme caution. I do want trans people in our country to know that this is a government that respects them, respects their identity, wants them to live with dignity and safety and inclusion. That is the approach the government is taking. I realise that decisions I have personally taken have not been received in that way, and that has not been comfortable for me, but I do believe it's been the right thing to do.
Bernard Jenkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. If we were resting this judgment on purely clinical evidence, it would be to tell every child that whatever sex they are is immutable and cannot be changed, and that if they take these puberty blockers, they may well find they have irreversibly changed the course of their lives. How is a child of 10 or 11 going to be capable of making that judgment? And whatever the CAS review says, in the end, it is his judgment. And I remember the COVID inquiry repeatedly saying it was wrong for ministers to hide behind the science. And equally, there is no single clinical advice. Clinicians are as equally divided as the rest of society on this question. We rely on his judgment, and I'm afraid I think he's got it wrong.
Well, can I thank the right honourable gentleman for his question and the way in which he puts his criticism too. And for the avoidance of doubt, as I said earlier, I know what my responsibilities are. I understand the decisions that I take in this office, and I understand that I'm accountable for those decisions, and I don't resolve from that. I am following clinical advice. I do think that is the right thing to do in this area. On the question of sex, he is right. Sex is immutable, and even having undergone treatment with hormones or surgery, there are still nonetheless underlying biology means that, for example, trans women would still need to be screened and treated, bearing in mind their biological sex, and the opposite being true for trans men. And we have to draw that distinction between biological sex and gender identity. The final thing I would say is, whatever my discomfort and personal views about this particular trial might be, or the notion of young people using puberty blockers in this way, I cannot ignore, and I should convey faithfully to the House, conversations I've had with trans young people and adults who have described in very powerful and unforgettable terms not just the life-changing but life-enhancing experience they've had. I think particularly of the university student I met, who, if she walked into this chamber now, you would assume was born female, is living her best life and described in very powerful and unforgettable terms the impact that treatment has had for her and her quality of life. At the same time, I think of high-profile cases like Kira Bell's. And that is why we have to tread extremely carefully in this area, follow evidence, build an evidence base, and why these are such finely balanced judgments, and why I can be simultaneously uncomfortable with the permanent ban I put in place and uncomfortable with this clinical trial. I think that's hopefully reassuring to people that I think very deeply about these issues before taking decisions.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This is a deeply troubling time, as the Health Secretary has said, for the trans community. And I've heard that loudly from my trans constituents that have come to surgeries and in my postbag too. And when suicide rates amongst trans people are higher, much higher than the general population, we know where denying that they exist or denying them life-saving healthcare leads. So what reassurances can the Secretary of State give to my trans constituents and the families that support them, who are extremely worried that they won't be able to access the healthcare that they need?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for his question, and I think the reassurance that we can provide to trans people in our country is that we are committed to making sure they have access to the highest quality and evidence-based healthcare. And that doesn't just apply in the case of children and young people, Madam Deputy Speaker. I hope to report to the House before the Christmas recess the work that's been undertaken in the Levy Review into adult services too. So we are committed to making sure that we provide high quality care to a particular vulnerable group of children and young people.
Kirsty Blackman.
Although I disagreed with the permanent ban that was put in place, it is to the Secretary of State's credit that he has been very clear about all of the competing issues that he's balancing in order to make the decisions that he's making, and I do appreciate that. What I would like to ask is, for those young people who were hoping or are hoping to be part of the clinical trial or hoping to receive puberty blockers for whatever reason, whether it will genuinely make a difference to their lives or whether they believe it will make a difference to their lives, how is he going to ensure that they are given appropriate support, the young people that do not get to become part of this trial when they've been hoping that this will be something that will change their lives?
Grateful to the honourable member for her question and the way she puts it as a critic of some of the decisions I've taken in this space. I think the reassurance I can offer is that the way in which the whole study will work is looking at the holistic care that this particular group of children and young people receive, and making sure that on the wider therapeutic side, in terms of mental health support, that support is there, it's evidence-led. So regardless of whether a young person receives puberty blockers, they will certainly receive that wider range of support.
Emily Darlington.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I really appreciate how the Secretary of State is taking a science-based approach. Yeah. I would like to understand, we use puberty blockers for many different conditions. Will there, within this trial, also be looking at the data that has been amassed from those use of puberty blockers for other conditions? Can we also just state on record puberty blockers are reversible, as shown in the evidence? When you stop taking them, they stop working. That is the science behind them. And finally, young people in my constituency are more likely to age out of gender services than they are to get their first appointment. What are we doing to shorten that waiting time, not just for puberty blockers, but actually for all the range of services the NHS provides for trans children?
Response. If members do not keep their questions short, I will not get everybody in, and the answers need to be just as short. Thank you.
I will try, Madam Deputy Speaker. The answer to my honourable friend's question is, firstly, we will make sure that in terms of the wider support that young people receive, that they get good access, that it's evidence-led, and I've had to wrestle with the fact that some trans people enter adulthood without ever receiving any sort of healthcare, and I've been heavily criticised by those people in particular for